When did you? I'm aware of your activity on campus. When did you first become interested in sort of education and other issues in the greater sort of Boston community, as opposed to things we were addressing on campus?
Well, I don't know if I ever did get interested. I got suspended from school. I
Yes,
lost my
I'm aware.
scholarship. I
I'm
had to
aware.
go back. I couldn't go to graduate school. I had debt from the government, and so teaching was a way to get rid of my debt. But I'd also taken a course at the Harvard Ed School with a whole group of Chicano educators who'd come up from the border of Texas and Arizona and New Mexico to study at Harvard Ed School, and I happened to be in a class with all of them. And they left Harvard Ed School. They came on scholarship and they left because they were so upset with not getting anything they needed from the school was so oriented toward rich white communities. And so it got me very interested in what they were talking about. So I decided maybe I could go and sort of disrupt. So I went into the Boston Public Schools at a time when a lot of us went into the Boston Public Schools. It wasn't just me, not with the intention of teaching, with the intention of organizing. I didn't expect to be there very long, and I walked into Grove Hall, and it was a maelstrom. The Panthers were there. Many of my kids were involved with the Panthers. The redlining that kept kids locked into horrible housing was there. The first year I was there, it was a girls' school. Second year, it was made co-ed. The third year, black students came in. It was total turmoil and total corruption. I don't know if you are remembering, but in Boston, if you wanted a promotion, you bought it.
Yes, yes.
And when I walked in the first week, the older women came to me and they said, "Look, honey, don't get yourself in trouble because you have to get on the list of one of the school committee members, and you have to pay a certain amount every year if you ever want to get anywhere in the system." And it was sort of around $50 at that time, unless you wanted to be a principal. Then you had to pay $500. We only made $6,000.
Yeah.
So the system was completely corrupt. And the other thing was, I don't think there had ever been a person of color teaching or administering in 127, if you could check the numbers, schools in Boston. So the staffs were totally segregated. The students were totally segregated. The resources were not there. And the kids were wonderful. And I loved them, and I didn't want to leave.
Yeah. What year did you first go in?
71.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's probably true. Interesting. My involvement developed. There was a clergyman who had Blue Hill Avenue, Lower Blue Hill Avenue, used to be Agency Row. And there was a man named Virgil Wood who was a clergyman, and he had been fighting against Louise Day Hicks. Now, interestingly enough, Virgil Wood has grown up he was from Lynchburg, Virginia, and he knew my father and my uncle, and I used to go over and help him. But he had started struggling against Louise Day Hicks in the early 60s. So I knew about the struggles against the policies and the approach that she had. And I agree with you that if you review the records of the school committee, you'll see that there was deliberate and intentional segregation. It didn't just evolve. And I agree with you that the school committee, I remember having, what's the man who was kind of dominant? I was appointed by Garrity.
Kerrigan? Are you?
Yeah. And I had a conversation with him, and he said, I appreciate that you're an activist and you have this desire for change. He said, but you'll discover the system is bigger than all of us, and you'll learn to play the game if you stay after the...
And black teachers paid him money for their promotions just as much as whites. And he was colorblind when it came to taking money.
But I remember the figures being a little bit higher than you that you cited if you wanted to be a coach or have an administrative position. I thought the figures were quite a bit higher than you. But the point is, you had to pay, and you could do it one of two ways: out of pocket, or you could sell tickets to some fundraisers that they held. But if you didn't do that, you didn't get it. But what happened is, so when did you first become aware of the sort of desegregation case that was moving through the courts?
Well, I really don't remember that because there was so much turmoil that was just one little aspect of what was going on. I mean, you had people fighting to get access to unions and jobs. You had every kind of movement going on. You had people coming back from Vietnam in terrible shape. You had, women. I was a basketball coach. Women didn't have sports. We were fighting to get women's sports. So between housing and medical care and the Panthers breakfast program, desegregation was really not on my radar the way it was with other people, I think.
Yeah, what happened is because my father had been an activist and because there were people so the way I came to Boston originally, was the schools were closed in Prince Edward County. And, I'd missed several years in school and had, to make up time. And this man met my father. He was helping him raise money, to continue legal struggles against the state of Virginia. And he said to my father, I know that you want your children to suffer the same as other children, but this boy belongs in school. And he got me enrolled and admitted to a New England prep school. And my father said, no, that's not happening. The optics of that. Then what happened in 1962, the American Friends Service Committee, which is the activist arm of the Quakers, or social arm, of outreach arm of the Quakers, they actually found homes and families that were willing to take some of us who had been shut out of school. So I came here in 1962. I got on a Greyhound bus in Richmond and came here to Boston. I remember getting off at the old Greyhound bus station down on St. James Street, picked up by the family that I was going to live with, and I went to school in Newton.
I had no idea of this.
So I tell kids, I know all about busing. The difference is I was bused 600 miles and I couldn't go home at night, and I only went home in the summers. And so I finished. I made up ground. I was already an activist. I insisted to the people at Newton, you're going to test me, and you're not putting me in a grade that's 2 or 3 years where the kids are 2 or 3 years younger, and I was already tall, and said I'm not doing that, and and so I made up ground in Newton, and then went on to college. And so I knew Virgil Wood, and Ruth Batson was one of the people who was engaged in bringing me here to Boston. I stayed in touch with her all through the years, and she introduced me to Mariel Snowden and Ellen Jackson and that whole coalition of people that were. Ellen had Project Exodus, which evolved into Medco, and I knew the whole group of community of people who were pushing for desegregation. But the biggest thing was working with Virgil and the whole struggle against Louise Day Hicks.
So how did you get involved with the court and Garrity and those guys?
Mm-hmm. Well, so what happened was I had been, when we were students and activists, I would go over and help Reverend Woods with the Blue Hill Christian Center. I would go. Ruth would involve me in some of her programs. I met Mariel Snowden and Otto, and I would go to Freedom House, and I met Ellen Jackson and what's the woman that passed away? Betty Johnson and some other people. And then Ken Haskins came to the ed school, and so I was working with a group of kids. I was working in a program in Cambridge trying to help kids who've been adjudicated and get back into schools. And Ken Haskins came to me and said, all of your friends, the people that you've been working with since you were undergraduate, they petitioned Garrity. They want someone black to be a part of the receivership team, and they're going to put your name in. You'll have to interview with him, and you'll have to interview with the parents. They want to know, would you be willing to do it? And I thought, this is a continuation of what I was born into and the struggles we were having in Virginia. And so, yeah, I'll go do it. And so I left the ed school. I was in a doctoral program. I left the ed school and went and I spoke to Garrity, and I ended up getting the job. And then later they added Al Holland, and he and I became friends. And Bill Heath. And so I wasn't there the first year. I joined in 76. And so and that's how I got involved.
And so all of these.
Did you feel an immense responsibility in that moment? Like, do you feel like I had to step up to this moment?
Yeah. I mean, the people came to me. I debated for a while, and then I thought, well, who better to work with these young people? And because of my experiences, I had been through, what it's like to be involved in desegregation. I'd been through the violence. I'd been through all of the stuff that I knew they were going to face. So, and I'd been an activist student, and I wasn't afraid to go into South Boston. I had also, my father, much to my mother's chagrin, it allowed me to go into the deeper South. I was 15, 16 when I first went into the deeper South, and so I felt that this was a continuation of my father's work, continuation of my family's work, and continuation of what my sisters and I represented as a result of being plaintiffs in a subsequent Supreme Court case. And
So you were on one end of this process. I was on the very other end of the process. So you were at South Boston, where black students of color, were coming to South Boston for the first time, being bussed in. I was at the Jeremiah Burke,
yes,
where white students were from South Boston High School
right.
were first coming to us. So for us, it was a welcoming. The parents were very, very leery of this whole thing, but the kids were like, they were having a great time. And the black students really did welcome white students, and it didn't last long because of other things that went on, but we were getting the effects of what you did. And the biggest effect of what you did that I can say, other than lots of money and staffing, was the parent councils.
Yes.
So for the first time, black and white parents, and we were meeting. Hattie McGinnis was a local leader.
Yes.
So she lived right near the Burke. She hosted every couple of weeks parent council meetings. The kids would all come to the parent council meetings. They would be in the living room eating pizza, and the parents and the teachers, because I would go all the time, were meeting in the dining room or kitchen. I don't remember.
Yes.
And for the first time, people were actually saying, we should have this. It was just an amazing experience.
That's interesting to have it from that side, but there's a name from the past. The one thing I would say is it would be nice for young people or for people who are looking at it. They're the names that we all know, but there were just so many activists. And that's one name. And people, so I was from the other end, and I had known people who were already leading efforts to desegregate the schools. And I would say to people, well, Judge Garrity forced this issue on. No, actually, the school committee forced this issue because the records are clear. I mean, he would have had no grounds for doing this, but then you find, for instance, that Columbia Point, people who lived in Columbia Point and who should have gone to South Boston, the school records
Coming to the Burke.
Yeah, the school minutes will clearly show that they were sent to the Burke and to other places.
They could have walked to South Boston High.
They could have walked up the hill to South Boston High.
And they were all sent to the Burke.
Yeah, and if they hadn't, so people are unaware. I think they want to make him out to be the culprit. They're unaware that the school committee gave him all the ammunition he needed, all the facts he needed, and the records were pretty clear of deliberate attempts to keep black kids in certain schools and out of other schools. It was as bad as the Deep South. You know?
And black staff.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You had no opportunity.
No opportunities.
No opportunity except within the black schools, which were like a little kernel
Right.
surrounded by others. But it wasn't just that. I mean, the resources, I was a basketball coach, and our rims were on the wall.
Yeah,
And they never got off the wall. That sort of thing. We had no parking. We had no facilities. We did have a science lab, I think, primitive, but
I'm sure that's right.
yeah, it was. Here's one thing that happened. Our cafeteria staff wanted to make a special meal for Black History Month.
Yes.
They wanted to make some sort of Southern cooking. And they were great. And the school department said, no, you can't do that. You have to have what... And they said, no, we'll buy the food and everything. Yes. And we would all pitch in and we would have, you name it, we would have it, right? No, the school department said no. And we appealed to God knows who, and they said no. Well, we went ahead and we had the meal. We had soul food, if you want to call it, whatever.
Yes.
For the whole school in defiance. It was ridiculous. And people were so happy to have it. It was like a revolution for one meal.
Well, it's funny. You started this by talking about if you wanted to be a teacher and you wanted to be promoted, you had to pay school committee member. I think John O'Brien came later. There were no blacks on the school committee, and they were all elected at large. They came later while they still had an elected school committee, and they came up with district members. But they divided up the schools, and it was, what I discovered, and I suspect you discovered the same thing, that the schools were a source of income and revenue and jobs. And only for a small number of students was it a place to, be educated and to go on to college or to go on or to be prepared for jobs. It was, I discovered so South Boston was put under receivership. So we had, as you say, the advantage of the judge, and we had monies that you didn't have. But you discover all these unusual practices, like the janitors. I think that the janitors really ran buildings. They had a budget to clean the buildings, and nobody ever spent the kind of money that they were allocated. A lot of that money went straight into people's pockets. I mean, I think that's been established. This is not heresy. I'm not making up stuff. And they had all these little practices where the janitors and somebody, you had to know somebody to get and you said, why would you want to be a janitor in the building? Because you had the whole maintenance budget. It was separate from, it wasn't under the principal's discretion. It was under the
city.
It was
city
under the janitors.
Right. Think, or something.
And the janitors.
Right. Here's another detail. I don't know if anybody knows this. When I started teaching in 1971,
yes,
you had to have 40% attendance to pass a class. As long as you had 40%.
You mean as a student?
As a student.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You only needed 40%
Right.
attendance and an F average. So that meant that a bright kid who maybe didn't have a real strong parental guidance or one thing or another could come to school essentially on Thursday and Friday, take the test,
Correct.
never come to school the rest of the time, and graduate with nothing. Nowhere to go, no counseling,
That's
nothing.
right.
So the educational requirements and standards had to be enforced by people like me
Yes.
or the black teachers, and it was really hard to do that because any kid who was knowledgeable said, well, gee, I can be working on the side, whatever. I'm not going to college anyway because whatever. And so not only were educational standards really low, and South Boston was just as bad as the Burke.
Always worse.
It probably worse. White, working class, black, didn't make any difference who you were. Desegregation uncovered corruption. It uncovered the standards. It uncovered facilities. It uncovered decision making. in a way that there was, it wasn't maybe what Garrity was talking about, but if it hadn't happened, I don't know. I mean, I was only 25 years old, so I mean, I couldn't, fight that. Even in the Boston Teachers Union,
Yes.
which I was a steward for a long time, people could get up to the microphone and use the vilest
Yes.
language about the kids,
Yes.
the vilest language publicly. Well, we came in out of the civil rights movement and we wouldn't stand for it. We would be up in arms and yelling, and you can't say stuff like that. And we challenged people, and we ended up completely changing the Boston Teachers Union. And it became a force for very progressive changes, and it still is.
Can you guys dig into more of that? Because you're so young when these major changes are happening. How did it feel being in those scenes? Can you describe what it felt like?
I wouldn't even dare tell you what our private lives were like, because we were also in the hippie generation. Not to say that we were hippies, but we were in the hippie generation.
Well, I don't think hippies was a black thing so much, but yeah.
well, whatever the equivalent
Yes.
was, the countercultures were very strong.
Counterculture, I think, yeah.
And you had the music
Yes.
of the black artists were finally beginning to make a living, and the messages that were coming out of, good heavens, Gil Scott-Heron, any of these people were such strong messages. We were listening to the same music as our students,
Yes.
which is definitely different from anything that had gone before. White or black or Chinese didn't make any difference. And don't forget, we had a lot of Chinese kids at that time, and a lot of Puerto Rican kids, not very many other Caribbean. Well, no,
Not a lot.
not a lot, not a
Yeah,
lot.
I agree with you.
So we at the Berkeley had a lot of Chinese students. So we had to also play, that was also part of what was going on. Those kids are,
It's interesting that you say so. The thing is, I think, so people call our parents' generation the greatest generation, and they talk a lot about the men and women who participated in World War II. And I know a lot of black men who, for various reasons, we won't get into that here, wanted to enlist in the army and fight in World War II. Most of them had to up their age, and so many of them went to the war. They may have been only 16 or 17, and they went to the war and they fought, and they matured. And I would say I was 15 years old the first time I went to jail in a demonstration. So I think that I matured much quicker than even my own kids. I watched them. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I was looking at a movie with Bevel in one of the southern towns when they had to use children. And my wife said, I'm in a second marriage. My wife said, I don't think I could have let my child go. And I broke out in a sweat, and I was thinking, I don't think I could have let my children go either. But I was 15, and I know that I would not have wanted my 15-year-old children to do what I did. So I don't know how you felt. I think, and then, of course, on campus, we were against the war in Vietnam. We were exposed in the use of chemicals and fighting against Dow Chemical, and the whole South Africa thing had just started to emerge, and the Gulf oil boycott. And I think that it forced us to mature a lot quicker. I mean, I was 29, I think. No, 27 or something like that when I went over to South Boston. But I felt like a grown man,
well, the other,
I want to jump in really quick, let you know we have about 8 minutes.
Oh,
I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning
okay.
when we're
We've been talking that long?
about that generational, because it's been a half century since
Yeah.
years happened. We talk about how Boston has changed over the last
Yeah.
half century, and also you're right, we're in a very different moment right now.
So Judith, I think one thing you said, I'd be curious how you now feel about it. People ask me all the time, was busing worth it? I mean, so if you're looking at achieving racial balance and you look at certain educational outcomes, one could argue, well, it was, but I think you raised a very important point. I know that we were very successful in bringing in a lot of black teachers, and we talked about some of the names to South Boston. And we used the judges' engagement with the school to push for more black teachers and administrators. So I think that changed significantly. It was maybe not the intention that Garrity had, but certainly a large number of black students. And as you say, the standards. I was appalled to find out the attendance rates at South Boston when we looked at the old records. People, you're right. People came to school when they damn well wanted to, and they graduated. And it's not like we messed up the education in the South, because the kids weren't going to college. They weren't going to vocational schools, and so there were what the busing thing did was pull the cover off these horrific practices.
Right.
The main one being that this was a source of revenue and patronage rather than education.
Right, but what it didn't do was change the system of white privilege at all. And I wouldn't even call it backlash, just the system reasserted itself in different ways. And it's been a continual battle to try to hold on to anything that we win. So you mentioned Albie Holland, who went into the war, came back, and was determined to change things in Boston. And that was true of Harry Wilson, and that was true of others. And they made a pact that they're going to change the city. And they did. But to hold on to those reforms and those changes has been extraordinarily difficult. And the gaps between the kids in the segregated neighborhoods, the housing. For example, several mayors had these arrangements with contractors that were supposed to provide affordable housing. So you build in the Seaport, and you give 15% for somebody to build in Mattapan, a substandard unit, and you build a luxury unit in Seaport. You're not putting poor people, working people, into the Seaport. You're continually segregating every neighborhood. The neighborhood where I live, you can't even imagine. We worked really hard when I moved to Dorchester, and a lot of SDS people formed Fair Share. Worked really hard to integrate, to bring in black families, working class, to keep black families. People were burning their houses rather than selling them to black people. And we had to form a ring around a black family's house because they were being firebombed all the time, right? Now, that's changed. But what's happened? The neighborhood has now become $1 million houses, gentrified, and those same families who moved in at that time, the African-American teachers and firefighters and so on, can't afford to live there. My kids can't afford to live there. My kids can't afford to live anywhere near me, and they're in Hyde Park, Mattapan, right, or out or moved. So I think we made critical changes. I think the system has survived our critical changes to some extent, or maybe to a large extent.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about bigger issues. I agree with you. But I do think if you just look at the schools, but they are impacted by the issues you're talking about. One of the things that was never done in Boston or any other city was the enforcement of fair housing and changing the way banks lent money. And that where one lives determines what the school makeup will look like. So over time, some resegregation occurred, and as you say, people of privilege, you go. I mean, one thing I never understood as a person from outside of Boston is how you could have a Boston Latin school and then have so many other schools that struggle. Now, you're from New York, and so that you're familiar with exam schools. I never liked that as a model for public schools, that you pump all this money in the Latin school, and maybe a few others. And I would have thought that you would want every school to be a Boston Latin. I mean, not necessarily to teach kids the classics and go on to college. I mean by that putting enough resources and focuses on quality for all of the students. that didn't happen, and it's not going to happen, but it hasn't happened in any major city in the U.S.
Well, let me tell you 2 or 3 areas where the gap between suburban, mostly white schools and Boston schools are so glaring you can't even look at it without just crying. One is athletics.
Oh, yeah.
You read the Global Scholastics. The biggest city in Boston has almost none. Sports has stopped being an avenue to go to college in Boston. We don't even have most of the sports that any small high school has. We don't have music programs. The other thing is we don't have high quality technical education in Boston. We used to have Boston Trade, prepared you for the trades. It was great in the sense that an awful lot of the tradespeople in Boston came out of Boston Trade. Madison Park has been starved for funds and resources. We are now at least a decade behind the suburban schools. Mayor Wu says she's going to change that. I've been working on it for the last 15 years of my life. It hasn't changed yet. So when you come to technical education, that is preparation for the jobs of this century. We don't do it. Small numbers. We do it in small numbers.
Yeah, I know we're coming to the end. My family's been engaged in school desegregation since 1951. And I would say there are 2 major flaws in all of the reform efforts. One is that nobody's ever addressed the school financing
Correctly.
process.
Yeah.
And it's tied to property values. Now, you talk about increased values in the city of Boston, but they don't set the rates because many of the people who own the $1 million homes don't have kids in the school system. And so the reason that suburban schools, every school in the U.S. is financed by property taxes, but there's an inherent inequality in that. And so that was something that Garrity, and that's something that school reformers have not touched. And so, one of the big no-nos in America is this whole thing of fair housing, finances for homes and home ownership. And the 2 are coupled in ways that we haven't explored. And until when people say, I hear Bernie Sanders and others saying education in social democracies in Europe, but that's because the schools are funded by national budgets. Here they're funded locally by property taxes, but that's inherently unequal. Yeah. And until that's addressed, we're going to see these. Boston couldn't touch that, and many of the reform efforts couldn't touch that.